Hey everybody, Mark again with Exotic Car Play Place. Today we're going to talk about two things. One, primarily, the one that you guys like to talk about the most, the BMW E60 M5 and the Lamborghini Gallardo. Now these two cars are two of my cars that I actually own. Yes, the real versions of these. These are just toys, of course. I actually have two of these cars. Today we're going to talk about the transmission specifically. And for those people that feel that the E60 is not a true supercar, let me assure you, this is every bit as super as this car in performance. But let me talk about specific details on the SMG transmission and the EGear transmission in the Lamborghini. We're going to talk about the driving experience as well as some of the technical details. So it's no secret, both of those cars have what I consider sort of the transitional technology in terms of gearboxes. Neither of them were really all that loved. The SMG transmission was kind of hated by a lot of people. Equal to that, it was also loved by a lot of people. It did things really well, but it did things kind of poorly as well. And the same thing I might say about the EGear transmission in the Lamborghini. It did things very well and it did things poorly. And we're going to talk about some of the details why that happens and what the deal is with both those cars. So the BMW product is called the SMG, Sequential Manual Gearbox. What is that? Well, in the M5, the E60 M5, it uses what they call the SMG3. So it's the third variation. It's a single clutch transmission actuated by an electronic pulse initiated from the pull of your paddle shifter on the steering wheel. The Lamborghini is the EGear, short for electronic gear, which is actuated also by the paddle shift and actuates a single clutch transmission as well. Made and produced by Magneti Marelli. It's a similar product as well found in the Ferraris. The 360 F1 and the 430 F1 share a very similar product. The difference is Ferrari dials their stuff in to be smoother and quicker. Lamborghini likes to set theirs up so it's a little harder shifting and a little more delayed. Very similar, but still have their differences. Now we talk about the differences. Some of the differences. Well, let's start with the fact that the SMG has a 7-speed gearbox. And it has ratios that will allow that car to run over 205 miles per hour if you run it to the red. The Lamborghini, on the other hand, has a 6-speed. Well, that 6-speed will really limit it. It's good for about 195, maybe 200 miles per hour, and you're pushing the red line. So it really doesn't technically, on paper, have the top limit that you'd find in the BMW. Now we talk about the speed of the shifts. Well, the speed of the SMG transmission can be dialed and recorded as being close to 65 milliseconds when set up in S6 mode and shifting in the hardest and quickest shift settings. The Lamborghini, a wee bit, I would say a tad bit slower, still on the subside of 100 milliseconds, is still very, very fast. And much faster than you'd find with any manual gearbox, but I would say generally as a whole, a hair slower than the SMG. Now, they both are set up distinctly different in terms of the operations. Now, the BMW has what they call drive logic, or uses drive logic, which has up to, they say, potentially 11 different modes. The Lamborghini has a little bit different technology there. They've kind of reduced basically the options. In the Lamborghini EGear system, you have the default mode. When you start up the car, it basically initiates a default mode which is manually operated, moderate speed in terms of shift speed, and doesn't shift that hard. Everything is kind of moderate. You know, it's a decent medium speed of shift. It shifts. It's not too intense. The downshift, like the rev matching, isn't all that intensive either. Everything is very mild. It also has an automatic mode, which can be basically enabled, so you can pretty much, drive the car off in automatic, and it'll take care of the shifting, the upshifts, the downshifts. It'll take care of that for you. And it also has, kind of a slippery when wet mode, which enables you to drive the car in poor conditions. So it does a lot more slipping, The shifts are even softer yet, so you don't want to disrupt the traction of the car in poor driving conditions, so you allow that with that extra feature. Now, aside from that, the reverse buttons, the reverse activation is very different on the E60 M5 versus the Lambo. The E60 has, it's kind of like the standard transmission where you pull it left and push it all the way forward. That's how you activate reverse on the E60 M5 SMG gearbox. On the Lamborghini, it's totally different. When you look at the console, it kind of throws you off. It's actually over on the left-hand side, or I guess for those left-hand driver cars, it's over next to the driver door on the opposite side of the steering wheel. You'll find a little button labeled R, and that is the reverse button. That initiates the reverse activation on the EGear for the Lamborghini. Now, the BMW has some other features, like when it's in auto mode, for example, it has a hill assist and an auto descent mode, which allows the car to maintain its stability control, and it doesn't roll excessively when you're in auto. It allows it some maintainability in terms of the position of that vehicle. It doesn't allow it to take off on you. The Lamborghini doesn't have anything like that. It's very basic. Then we move on to other features. Launch control. Well, the E60 M5, if you've seen some of my previous videos, you know the E60 does have launch control. Sadly enough, the US Canadian versions only have a dumbed down version which reduces the RPM before takeoff. So it doesn't hit it as hard, it doesn't accelerate quite as quickly, and thus you've got a poor 0 to 60 launch time with the American Canadian version of the E60. The Lamborghini Gallardo, on the other hand, doesn't technically have a proper launch control, at least not until you get into the LP cars. So if you get a 2009 and newer, it has basically like a thrust mode or a launch control, which it does enable to function in that capacity. Sad part is the EGear transmissions, and we know the reduced clutch life in those cars. It is not conducive to maintaining long life on the gearbox or the clutch in the Lamborghini if you activate the launch control or thrust mode. So really, it's not advisable to use that. Now this brings us to another topic, is the neutral. How do you activate neutral in both of these cars? Well, let me explain. In the BMW E60 M5, neutral is activated by pulling over the gear shift lever and finding that position. You have to toggle the gear shift in the center. In the console, you toggle that over, that puts you into neutral. That's fine. In the Lamborghini, it very much works like most other Italian cars, like the Ferraris and the F1 systems, where you pull both levers, that then toggles it into neutral. Down, 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 up, up, up. If you want to hit neutral, you pull two keystrokes at simultaneously. That drops it into neutral. That being said, let's talk about that for a second here, because in the E60 M5, I noticed in the forums there's been a lot of talk about, do you put that car in neutral when you're at the lights? Or do you not put it? Do you just leave it in drive? Well, the way my understanding of how that system actually works, it truly does work like a manual transmission. And the same really applies for the Lamborghini. And I would say leaving the car in gear at a set of lights for an extended period of time will take a toll on that clutch. Well, some will say, like in the EGear transmission or in the SMG transmission, for example, how can that possibly wear when it disengages the clutch? It's fully disengaged and you're idling at a set of lights. There may be truth to that. But when you're doing that and you disengage a clutch, picture what you're doing with a manual transmission. A manual transmission, you're putting in the clutch. It's doing the same thing. You're holding the clutch in, effectively the gearbox, and everything is disengaged. But what's that doing? It's taking a toll not on the friction plate, but actually on the clutch release or the throwout bearing. So if you're holding that clutch in for an extended period of time, you can assume you are going to see extended wear and very accelerated wear on that clutch, and more specifically on the release bearing. And that really goes for the E60 M5 and the same thing on the Lamborghini. The Gallardo you definitely don't want. There's a lot of talk on the forums about that too. It's always better to just throw the car in neutral. If you expect to be there for more than 5-10 seconds, I would pretty much just throw it in neutral and be done with that. Now that moves us on to the next topic, how the paddles are situated in these cars. The E60 M5 is situated in a position where the paddles follow the steering wheel. So as you turn the wheel, the paddles are mounted to the back of the steering wheel. So as you turn the wheel, you've got paddles in the position that your hands might be. That's if you're holding the steering wheel in the same position. If you're one of those drivers that kind of does the rollover, you're doing a big turn. For example, you're doing a left-hand turn at an intersection. You got your signal on, car's going by, you're in first gear, off you go. Now you're getting halfway through the intersection and you want to go for second gear. What I find this very awkward with the BMW transmission is as you're turning it, sometimes you're turning enough that you're getting a full lock almost. You're almost getting a full turn and a half to make that left-hand turn in traffic. Well, as soon as you do that, you've lost your position. You don't know where you're at. Now you're looking for that plus or minus. And a lot of times what I found is by the time you're turning at a 90 degrees and you're going into make that left-hand turn, often, I would say more often than not, my upshift is actually by my left hand now. By the time I shift it, my upshift is over here. It's in the opposite side that I would expect it to be. That being said, if you're on a racetrack or an environment where you're making smaller adjustments, it's probably a better position to have the SMG paddles actually mounted on the steering wheel, because when you're on a racetrack, you're not turning full lock. You're making much more subtle turns. And so on a racetrack, it makes more sense to have them on the steering wheel. But I would say in normal driving conditions, that's where I prefer the EGear setup, where typically you'd find that on most Italian cars, and the Ferraris are alike, in that you would find them mounted to the stock. So you turn the wheel, they're always in that same position. Doesn't matter where the steering wheel is. Your upshift is always on the right hand, and your downshift still always in your left hand. So that's always going to remain in the same position, so there's less guesswork. The only catch there is, if you've noticed on the EGear cars, the paddles are very small versus a lot of the modern day Ferraris and that, and even the Huracan, for example, have a very long extended paddle. So even if you're off a little bit, it's still in a position of, it's easy to grab. Where the EGear, you're a lot more, it's a smaller zone to grab the shifters. So it's a little awkward at that point. That's the difference in those two. So that's really all I'm going to talk about on the specific specifications on the two cars. Now, can I explain a little bit on how the cars drive, how they behave when they're in their best modes? I'll explain briefly. Let's talk about the E60 firstly. Now, the E60, there's no secret. A lot of disappointment set in when a lot of people drive those cars in default mode. You fire up the car, you take off in manual mode in default setting, kind of the mid-range. You've got the 2 or 3 bars on your transmission shift settings, and you're setting off and you're trying to go for a shift. That is extremely awkward, and I find, to be honest, very lurchy. It's up and down, and you feel like you're up and down more than George Michael's drawers, bouncing back and forth every time you're shifting a transmission on the SMG transmission. It's very lurchy and up and down, and you're kind of surging back and forth. It's sort of a wave. It's almost like you're on a bit of a cruise ship there. It's a bit of an uneasy feeling when you're in the lower settings. That being said, it very quickly transforms to a very aggressive animal. So if you set the M button and you activate the S6, so now you're in the top most aggressive dialed-in setting for performance on the SMG transmission, it is arguably better than the EGear transmission. In my opinion, it's as sharp, like it's very, very quick shifting, hard shifting. You can break rubber, no problem there. But what it does it so much more, I don't want to use the word efficiently, it's a much, much more refined feeling than you get from the EGear transmission. So that brings us over to the EGear drive. When you're driving the EGear transmission, a Lamborghini, there is no really, really dumb mode. Even when you're setting up on the default, so you fire up the car and off you set in the manual or in the standard mode or the default mode in the EGear transmission, what you typically find is that it's still a decent speed. There's a little bit of a delay there, but it's not half of what you find in the SMG transmission. The EGear is quite a bit faster, even in the default setting. So it's not as painful to operate in kind of regular mode. That being said, you dial up the sport mode, you activate the sport button, and when you do that, your backside gets hammered harder than Elton John on a Saturday night. Now, oh yeah! In sport mode, the EGear transmission hits very hard, and if you almost get the sense that you can feel the driveline shudder almost underneath the car. So I would say the sport mode is good if you're driving it moderately, if you're driving it, half acceleration. But if you're driving hard and aggressively, you can definitely feel the transmission taking a toll on the driveline. It's very hard, shifts hard, it's very brutal. It's very exciting, but definitely it takes its toll on the car. It definitely feels that way anyway. So on that note, there's a couple of things I might want to point out too. The two cars are dramatically different on take-up. Now, when you're taking off from a standstill, that's where the BMW, as bad as a lot of people talk about its performance or the SMG, the way it behaves, it's still a lot smoother on a take-up than you typically find in the EGear transmission. If you get on the SMG off a standstill and you kind of get on it with a half throttle, it actually engages fairly smoothly and off it goes. It's actually a decent rush. So it's fairly refined feeling. I mean, it's not a DCT. Dual clutch transmissions are leagues ahead of the SMG in terms of that refinement and the smooth engagement. But the SMG engages not bad when you get on it, kind of that half to 2/3 throttle off a stop. The Lamborghini and the Gallardo EGear, for example, is kind of the opposite. If you get on that with half throttle or 2/3 throttle, sometimes you're welcomed with an excessive amount of jerkiness to where it's almost throwing you out of the seat. Extremely embarrassing. You have people next to you at a set of lights and you decide you want to launch semi-quickly. Sometimes if it engages just in the wrong manner, you start surging back and forth. You look like you're in a bucking bronco, and it's extremely embarrassing. So it's that initial take-up that is very awkward, and that's partially what you hear as rumors when they talk about why the EGear is so bad. I'd say largely that's the primary reason why the EGear has been so criticized. It's because its initial engagement in first gear. Once you're on the fly, it's amazing. It's a very stout, aggressive, relatively brisk and crisp sharping transmission, while the SMG is not as crisp but is very smooth and definitely more refined feeling. So that's where they're both distinctly different. As well, on one finishing note, since we're talking at the kind of the back end of the video, everybody, I'll talk about the reverse engagement. That is something they say, of course you need to back up a car at times. Minimize the amount you do that. The more you back up or engage up on hills or backwards up hills, those are the worst things you're going to do to that transmission and the clutch. Not so much the transmission, really. The clutch takes a brutal beating from both of the cars. So plan your routes, plan your parking, but limit the amount of reversing that you do. Reduce as much kind of as you can on the engagement out of first gear on big hills. Try to reduce that as much as you can. Hey, if you live in a town like San Francisco, kind of hard to eliminate that altogether. But I would say as a whole, that's something you want to keep in mind. You want to try to eliminate that. So everybody, that is the comparison. I wanted to point out the obvious comparisons and the differences. There's a lot of comparison. Why? I love these two cars. That's why I bought both of them. They both share very similar specifications. They both have the V10. Both have around 500 horsepower. Both share an automated manual gearbox. And for that reason, I think this is a very good comparison. You tell me which one you guys like better. I know I have a lot of fans that love that E60, and I equally love that car. It's amazing. It does so many great things. But I also love the Lamborghini Gallardo. It strikes a lot of passion, and it's an amazing car to drive. It's a great Sunday or a Sunday driver or one of those Friday night rippers. They're both great cars. They both have a place in my life. And why don't you drop me a line, everybody? Let me know which one you like. What's the choice for you? If you were to pick one of these cars, what would it be and why would it be that way? So again, if you're not already subscribed to everybody, you make sure you drop a line and subscribe to my channel. I'd love to see you guys on the next one. Please come back real soon and we'll talk to you then. All right. Bye-bye.